When 67-year-old Thomas Ray heard rustling sounds behind his shed that brisk October morning on the edge of KwaZulu-Natal's protected woodlands, he figured it was just the wind playing tricks through the tall grass. He was halfway through chopping kindling, the blade of his axe resting against his knee, when the sound came again, low, strained, almost like breathing filtered through gravel. Not the wind, not a mongoose or porcupine either, something bigger, slower. He set the axe down carefully and tapped his walking stick twice on the shed's tin siding. A few birds startled from the trees, but the sound didn't stop. If anything, it was closer. He stepped around the corner, the grass crunching faintly beneath his boots, and then froze. Nestled awkwardly behind a collapsed section of fencing and hunched under the overhang of a broken pallet was a bear. Not one of the massive coastal males he'd seen on documentaries, but a thick-bodied female, her coat patchy with burrs and streaked with mud. Her ribs showed through just enough to cause concern. Her head lifted slowly when she saw him, but she didn't growl. Her breath came heavy, and her sides heaved with every exhale. Then he noticed her belly, round, unnaturally so. "Well," Thomas said softly, adjusting the brim of his faded hat, "you sure picked a fine place to settle in." He backed away slowly and returned to the house, leaving the shed door open behind him. His hands trembled only slightly as he dialed the local wildlife rescue line. A man named Caleb answered. "Pregnant? And she's not attacking?" "Just watching," Thomas said. "Tired looking. Hurt maybe. Definitely hungry." Caleb exhaled sharply. "We're beyond capacity. Can't send a truck right now, but if you're willing, I can guide you through stabilizing her until we arrange transport." Thomas didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do." They made a plan. Reinforce the stall at the back of the shed with steel bars and wire mesh. Create a warm bed of hay and old blankets. Place bowls of sugar water and shredded chicken near the entrance and back away. Use heavy gloves. Move slowly. Speak gently. That night, Thomas stood by the shed for nearly an hour after sunset, watching her through the small window. She hadn't moved, but the chicken was gone in the morning. He started calling her Isolde. He wasn't sure why. It was a name his mother once mentioned, from an old story or myth, and it seemed to suit her, ancient, strong, and worn down by grief. Over the next week, Isolde began shifting her weight more, standing to drink water, sniffing cautiously when Thomas approached with food. She never lunged, never growled. She just watched him, breathing in slow, careful huffs like she was still deciding if he was part of the problem or the solution. He told her stories while he worked, about how the mango trees used to bear sweeter fruit, about his brother who'd passed 2 winters ago, about the day he tried to fix the roof and ended up with 3 stitches and a broken radio. Then came the night she gave birth. It was just after midnight when Thomas heard the first low whine, followed by a grunt, then silence. He didn't interfere, just sat quietly outside the shed, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping tea until dawn. When he peeked through the slats at sunrise, Isolde was curled protectively around 2 slick, trembling bundles. Their eyes weren't open yet, and their fur was wet and clumped in spots, but they squirmed with surprising energy. "You really did it," he whispered, tipping his cap. "You held on long enough." He called Caleb again. "They're breathing. Strong lungs, judging by the racket." "Names?" Caleb asked. "Thinking of calling them Moss and Bramble," Thomas said. "Moss because he's quiet. Bramble because she already rolled herself into the feed bucket." Caleb laughed. "Sounds like they'll keep you busy." They did. Within 3 weeks, Bramble had climbed halfway up a rickety ladder. Thomas forgot to move, and Moss had figured out how to open the stall door just enough to squeeze his head through and get stuck. Thomas added more reinforcements. Caleb sent over stronger latches and feeding guidelines. When Isolde needed rest, she'd nudge the cubs into the hay and then press her head against the bars closest to where Thomas sat, reading aloud or carving wood. Once, she let out a soft, rasping growl, not warning, but something that almost sounded like a hum. He never told anyone, but it made his eyes sting. As the cubs grew, so did their chaos. Bramble liked to steal Thomas's gloves and bury them behind the compost pile. Moss developed a habit of knocking over water buckets just to watch them tip. Isolde bore it all with an exhausted grace, always alert, always aware of where her children were. When one disappeared behind a feed barrel, she'd grunt, wait, then grunt louder until the cub emerged with a guilty expression. Caleb came to visit 2 months in. He stood beside the reinforced stall, clipboard in hand, and whistled under his breath. "She trusts you." "That's rare." Thomas nodded. "I think she knows I didn't have to help." Caleb crouched to observe the cubs wrestling over a torn piece of blanket. "They're strong, too used to humans for full release, but maybe we could try a transitional sanctuary." "You mean one of those preserves with guided rewilding?" "Exactly," Caleb said. "It's not cages, it's fenced forest, big territory, controlled food drops, minimal contact, but they'd need you at the bridge." Thomas didn't answer right away. That night, Isolde fell asleep with her head close to the gate, the cubs curled between her paws. He reached through the bars and gently set down a worn tennis ball Bramble had taken to chasing. Then he whispered, "If you're willing, girl, maybe I am too." Over the next month, Thomas built a temporary enclosure in the back paddock. Tall fencing, hidden dens, logs for climbing, even a small stream redirected from the irrigation channel. He moved them gradually, feeding them inside the new space and letting them explore under supervision. Bramble fell into the stream on the first day. Moss stole a carrot from Thomas's lunch and dragged it triumphantly across the yard. Isolde explored every corner, then returned to lie in the sun. By the time they were 4 months old, the sanctuary in the northern hills of KwaZulu-Natal was ready. 3 acres of rugged terrain, thick with tangled brush and shaded boulders. The day of the move, Thomas rode in the back of the transport truck, one hand resting near Isolde's crate. She didn't pace, just watched him through the grate, calm. When the gates opened at the preserve, she stepped out first, nose lifted, scenting the breeze. Then she looked back and gave a soft huff. The cubs followed her like shadows. The first few weeks were tentative. Thomas visited daily, bringing familiar scents, treats, and his old stool to sit on. Moss greeted him by headbutting the gate. Bramble once shoved a dead lizard into his boot as a gift. Isolde always emerged slowly, circling once before settling nearby. She never made a sound, but Thomas could feel her presence like a second heartbeat. Months passed. The cubs grew sleeker, faster. Bramble could now leap the low rock wall in one bound. Moss climbed trees just to nap in the crook of branches. Isolde aged with quiet dignity. Her limp never fully disappeared, but she moved with measured confidence. The staff started calling Thomas Barber Tom. They offered him a permanent position, sanctuary volunteer, educational speaker, mentor to orphaned cubs. He accepted without hesitation. Years slipped by like wind through acacia leaves. Moss and Bramble became local legends. Bramble once startled a tour group by leaping onto a ledge above the viewing station and letting out a deafening huff, then calmly licking her paw like nothing happened. Moss preferred shadowy corners, emerging only when he felt like it, often to swipe fruit from distracted researchers. But they always came when Thomas called. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. Isolde remained the heart of the sanctuary. She'd meet Thomas at the fence every time he came, sit beside him while he spoke softly about whatever filled his mind that day. Dry seasons, broken radios, the memory of his brother's laugh. Sometimes she'd press her forehead to the mesh, and he'd do the same. No words, just presence. Then one quiet morning, he arrived to find her lying beneath the thorn tree near the creek. Moss was beside her, his body pressed close. Bramble paced nearby, low huffs escaping her chest. Thomas knew before he reached the fence. Isolde's chest no longer rose and fell. Her eyes were closed, her limbs still. He crouched, knees cracking, and touched the ground near the fence. "You earned your rest," he said. "You gave them the world." They buried her under that tree, a place she had claimed as her own. Bramble brought an old torn tarp she'd hoarded and laid it beside the grave. Moss climbed the tree and remained there all night, unmoving. Thomas stayed too, his old bones complaining, but his spirit still and full. In the morning, as the sun cracked open over the hills, Moss let out a sound Thomas had never heard. A long, echoing moan, more sorrow than roar, more hymn than grief. It travelled through the trees like a thread of memory. Thomas felt it in his bones. A farewell, a thank you, a love that asked for nothing in return. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves like the soft turning of a page. A few birds took off from the nearby reeds, startled by nothing except that ancient sound still hanging in the air. Bramble lay curled beside the grave, her wide eyes fixed on the place her mother had vanished into the earth. Thomas knelt and pressed his hand into the dirt, whispering words even he didn't fully understand. Words of peace, of promise, of staying close. He didn't go home that night. He stayed right there beneath the marula, leaning back against the bark until his breath steadied with the wind. Sometime during the night, Moss climbed down and rested beside him, her heavy body radiating heat. Bramble followed soon after, and there, with 2 wild bears asleep against his sides and stars flickering through the branches, Thomas dozed off, content, held and holding. After that, he came every day, sometimes with tools to fix gates, sometimes with snacks, sometimes with nothing but time. Bramble would roll in the dust at his feet. Moss would nudge his arm until he told a story. The staff gave him space, nodding in quiet understanding as he lingered longer than planned. The 2 bears, now fully grown, still met him at the edge of their world, still brought him pine cones and bones and once, a mangled umbrella they clearly considered treasure. Once, he brought an old radio and let it play soft music beneath the tree. Bramble tilted her head, listening as if trying to understand. Moss huffed and lay down close, resting her chin on his boot. They stayed like that until the cassette clicked to silence. Another time, he brought paint and let the girls watch as he brushed color onto a canvas. He wasn't much of a painter, but it didn't matter. He painted the marula and the sky behind it, and 2 golden shapes hidden in the grass. The bond didn't fade with time. If anything, it deepened. Moss would meet his truck before he even got out, and Bramble once dragged a blanket halfway across the enclosure to where he sat, just so he could share the shade. On cold mornings, they'd press close, breathing clouds into the frosted air. And on hot ones, Thomas sat with his feet in the water trough while they soaked beside him, blinking slow and happy. Volunteers often watched from a distance. Cameras came out, sometimes even reporters, but the bears ignored them all. Their world stopped at the sound of Thomas's voice, the rasp of it, the stories he told, the quiet between them. He wasn't just a visitor, he was memory. He was part of the den. They were wild, fierce, untamed, but not to him, never to him. Because some bonds aren't about blood or species. Some families are made by choice, by chance, by an old man who listened when no one else did, and a mother bear who knew enough to trust him.